Hello, my name is Cecilia from the NYDA team, and you are listening to the NYDA podcast. We conduct due diligence and monitoring of working conditions using worker engagement technologies. And on this third season of this podcast, we want to support procurement and sustainability professionals with powerful insights relating to human rights due diligence. What are the legal requirements when considered practically, and what would constitute good practice? We bring you some of the leading voices in this field to answer these important questions. Come and join us.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon to everyone listening. We're back on another podcast for the third kind of podcast series, third and wider podcast series. We're focusing in this series on human rights due diligence. And the experiences of some of our favorite partners. We've kind of cherry-picked human beings in this landscape we feel have a particular kind of vantage points and experience and insight that's worth sharing. So enough of that. Would love to welcome Shawn McDonald, Chief Exec of Verite. Shawn just shared a moment ago that he's been with Verite for 19 years, which I think is, deserves congratulations in itself. Verite is well known in the sector to be a party with a lot of integrity and a non-profit organization that takes on some of the thorniest issues, such as forced labor, such as human trafficking and irresponsible recruitment, amongst many others. So Verite provides assessments, training, consulting services, and more. I'm hoping that Shawn can tell you, can do a better job of describing, the extent of their work. But wanted to stop there and give Shawn an opportunity to say hi and please add anything you'd like to my introduction, Shawn.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to join you on this podcast, and I appreciate that introduction. As you noted, Verite is a civil society organization that promotes labor rights globally, and we do it through a variety of mechanisms. We do assessments and trainings and consulting and research and policy advocacy, because we really feel like this problem is so large and complicated that it's important to attack it from a lot of different angles and working with a lot of different stakeholders, including and wider, not just working closely with companies to really understand what's happening in their supply chains, but then also working with other civil society organizations, unions, and increasingly with governments around the world to implement the right kind of supply chain due diligence policies and practices so that we can finally begin to make more progress on the rife problems of labor abuse in all sorts of supply chains worldwide, not just in poor countries, but in advanced economies as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Shawn. And wanted to dive in. The topic we're wanting to cover today is going to be kind of quite far-reaching in the sense that we'd love to talk about human rights due diligence, the kind of historical context thereof, and the relationship between human rights due diligence and responsible or irresponsible recruitment. And then inevitably in that conversation, we will touch on remediation and where and when it's been appropriate and experiences that Verite and Shawn may have had in that space. But let's start from the top. Shawn, over the last 18 months, even to 2 years, when you consider the effort that was going into already drafting, the EU directive and lobbying for further due diligence legislation after the French had introduced theirs in Europe. But suddenly, over the last 2 years to 18 months, we've seen a legal landscape really much more activated when it comes to human rights due diligence and the specifics of what constitutes appropriate due diligence along a global supply chain. What do you think are the biggest kind of contextual factors or enabling factors behind that change?
Right, it really is. The past couple of years have been really very exciting for those of us who have been focused on labor issues and human rights issues and global supply chains for for decades, right? Because this isn't a new problem. People have been talking about how to hold companies accountable for their the effects of their supply chains, both on the environment, on labor rights, and other human rights, for a very long time. But essentially, there hasn't been any mechanisms by which, outside national context, the companies have been held accountable. But because of the increased focus, particularly on the most abusive labor scenarios that tend to be thought of as modern day slavery or human trafficking or forced labor, the widespread attention from the media, from civil society organizations, from rights holders and victims and survivors themselves have really placed a really intense spotlight on how dysfunctional these supply chains really can be. And as I mentioned before, that the problem is widespread across lots of kinds of sectors and lots of different countries. And so I think what we have is this intense focus on modern day slavery, combined with a growing sense that there need to be new mechanisms, new ways that companies are held accountable, because at the local level and at the national level, even though they're very often very strong laws, they're just not enforced or not enforced well. And so we're suddenly seeing either the reactivation of existing laws like the Tariff Act in the United States, or the creation of new mechanisms like transparency regulations or mandatory human rights due diligence and other kinds of legal mechanisms to finally say, how can we do this? The World Trade Organization, way back in the 1990s, people will remember, people tried to think of ways to use the new WTO as a mechanism for injecting some kind of standards around human rights and environment into global trade. Because that didn't happen, activists around the world and policymakers have come up with some of these new and innovative ways to do so. And so I see it as a really terrific opportunity for those of us like Andwider and Verite and many other groups to finally take a hold of these opportunities and say, we finally have some mechanisms by which more companies, not just the big companies, the big name brands that tend to get a lot of scrutiny and all the attention, but companies of all sizes, companies from all different kinds of sectors, to be held accountable the way they never had before. And so it's real opportunity for those of us, but it's also a little bit, I have a bit of trepidation in a sense, because in its way, it's like getting everything that you've wanted. We finally have governments, very powerful governments like the United States or Canada or Mexico over here in the Western Hemisphere, or the European Union, UK, some other players, including Japan, coming along with these issues. But we have to really make sure that this notion of due diligence is defined and implemented in a really robust way, where we really have real outcomes for workers, real impact. That it's not just an exercise in a tick box exercise, or a way that companies say that they're doing something but don't necessarily really change their behavior in a way that improves the situation for workers. So I'm really excited about these, but I think there's a lot of work to be done to take advantage of this opportunity that's being handed to us. I don't say just us, meaning civil society organizations and labor advocates, but companies as well. Many companies for years have been frustrated that their peers or other companies or companies from other sectors are not held accountable the same way that some of the bigger companies have. And I think a lot of companies want to make sure that these are enforced in a way that raises the floor for everybody and has a level playing field for all.
Yeah, such a strong point. And I must confess, I share the trepidation about the box checking. In a way, I completely respect the role of legislation to ensure that there's broad literacy and a level playing field, and that the bar gets raised for everyone.
Right.
But at the same time, when legislation is the central driver, inevitably the focus of brands who manage complex supply chains turns to compliance, turns to, okay, what is it I absolutely have to do? And you do get a little bit of a kind of let's wait and see dynamic emerging, where some brands very very used to weathering legal reforms, have C-levels who advise, don't get overexcited, don't invest too much right now. Let's wait and see what enforcement looks like, what the first cases, look like, and what the minimum is that's needed.
Right.
So I think, Verite, like and wider, like our other partners, for partners of Verite's and mine, often there's an ecosystem we're both part of, and we've got a wonderful opportunity to say, due diligence is a language, and that's really useful, but let's get really good at doing it, because there's all sorts of very healthy reasons why due diligence needs to happen. But it's not because there's a law that we need due diligence.
Right.
There are supply chains that we need due diligence. And also to kind of again and again articulate in a very material, very practical manner what the benefits to suppliers are when it comes to human rights due diligence. I mean, why should a supplier care about human rights due diligence, beyond the compliance landscape?
Yeah, well, I think I'm glad you mentioned that point about suppliers, because as we know that for years, as companies have tried to implement codes of conduct with their suppliers around the world, there's been this very contentious, complex dance between buyers and suppliers, where the buyers want more from the suppliers, but aren't necessarily willing to pay more. And the suppliers are trying to just essentially do what they need to keep the business relationship going. And that's why I feel like this injection of some form of governmental accountability, and the possibility of an enforcement action is going to shake up that relationship a bit, but only a bit. And it's really only based on how well these governments, whether it's the European Union with the mandatory human rights due diligence, or Customs and Border Protection here in the US with the import ban, targets companies to show what practices, what bad practices that they're actually trying to change, right? And not just focus on one particular country or one particular sector, but ensure that a broad base of companies has a reasonable sense that they may be caught up in these regulations, and therefore have to begin to move beyond the relationship that tends to exist between buyer and supplier to one that really gets down to brass tacks. And what I mean by that is very often what we see, whether it's around responsible recruitment or a lot of other compliance issues, is that the financial arrangement between buyers and suppliers doesn't necessarily enable true change at the supplier level. So just for example, with recruitment, most people now know, because of the intense focus on modern day slavery, that many migrant workers are in debt bondage, specifically because the workers are paying for their jobs, not the supplier, and not the brand that's buying from that supplier. That's a hard issue of numbers, right? If people are paying thousands of dollars to get a job, and then you multiply that by thousands, we have millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of human resource costs that are not being covered by the businesses that seek and benefit from those workers. And until buyers and suppliers reckon with who's going to pay those costs, now that there is the possibility of enforcement action against those that don't pay it, then they're going to remain in this risky state of being perhaps having their goods stopped by US Customs, and then in the future by the European Union, but also continue to be in this position of enabling and benefiting from modern day slavery. And so I use that as an example of a case where there's hard economic facts that need to be reckoned with between the buyer and supplier about who's going to pay for these costs. And until you change those dynamics and those relationships, and at the same time change the market forces, where people realize that it's better for them to pay some of these costs than face the market consequences of an import ban or something like that. I really feel like it's shaking up the economics and these relationships, but you still need more enforcement action, I think, before more companies pay attention. And crucially, particularly here in the US, where we're famously a litigious society, but We also see that a lot of lawyers are counseling their clients to perhaps do less due diligence so that there's not a paper trail that's created that could get them in trouble. And so that's another unintended consequence of some of these things where some legal advisors may say to companies, don't look too closely, because then if you get caught, you can claim that you didn't know. So that's one of the unintended consequences that I'm also concerned about. But that's why it's crucial for us in this space to really build the awareness and capacity of a wide range of people, lawyers, so they begin to realize that a knee-jerk conservative response to just say, don't look, put your head in the sand, evolves to the point where they say they're better serving their client by gathering more information, doing more due diligence, doing better due diligence, engaging in these issues, begin to fix them, and that will serve their client better. But also, think about it, we have a whole range of government officials, procurement officials, because of course part of the new regulations are around procurement here in the US and in Europe, Australia, elsewhere. So procurement officials, thousands and thousands of people around the world working for government procurement need to understand what due diligence looks like. We have people in customs services that now need to understand these things. So we have a learning curve that we need to help people move along within government, within businesses, within the legal profession, in addition to media and civil society groups, because a lot of civil society groups know very well how to raise attention to these issues, bring to light a lot of abuses, criticize the behavior of companies. But civil society also needs to get better at saying, this is exactly what good due diligence looks like. These are the metrics we want to see you meet, both companies, and these are the metrics we want governments to begin to enforce. And so there's a lot of work among civil society groups too to understand what can and should be promoted as good due diligence, and then companies held accountable to that. So it's this vacuum that we all need to fill with more information, more insights, and then a carefully calibrated plans for having robust expectations of due diligence, but not expectations that are so aspirational that nobody will be able to meet them. And then we have this kind of cynical tick box exercise where people claim they're doing something, but really aren't.
Such very strong points. And Shawn, that point you made about the legal advice sometimes being do less rather than more. I think, it's interesting, I'm no legal expert, but I think there might be a slight difference between the Customs and Border Patrol enforcement of withhold release orders in the US and the enforcement that we will see, rather than are seeing, of human rights due diligence laws, in Germany. France, essentially, that ship has sailed, and that enforcement should already be happening. But in Germany, as of the 1st of January, with a much more specific German human rights due diligence law, and then later in Norway, etc. But what strikes me, but I'm actually, this is an open question, and maybe I'm wrong, is with knowing and showing. I don't know what withhold release orders, what level of detail is required, but with the human rights due diligence laws, what I appreciate about these laws is that they're quite specific in what needs to be in that mix. What constitutes human rights due diligence, as what constitutes adequate human rights due diligence, and there. Not knowing is not an excuse. There you're supposed to have done your homework. The law has required you to have a due diligence funnel, to have risk assessed your due diligence, addressed what you found, and be tracking the consequences and be able to communicate that to all your stakeholders, and have real data to support all of that, because you're supposed to be engaging meaningfully with your stakeholders. So a company turning around and saying, oh, we just didn't know. I'm assuming in that context with human rights due diligence laws in Europe wouldn't quite float.
Mhm. Right, but everything that you mentioned, the concern I have is, I agree, it's better to have more specific requirements, as the Germans and the others in Europe are going to be articulating. But a typical and not particularly effective due diligence system that a lot of companies have now and that have been pursuing for the past couple of decades could easily slot into what you just described, right? Where they'll say, of course we do due diligence. We sort out our suppliers and give them a red, green, yellow score or something like that. What's more risky? We subscribe to this or that information service that tells us which countries are more risky than others. We do audits. We have some systems in place to check things, and that's kind of the state of play for a lot of companies now. But we know that despite those, that generally they're not making a lot of progress in terms of truly changing the experience for workers in terms of their ability to form a union in countries where that's repressed, that right is repressed, where the wages are still very insufficient, where there's still a lot of sexual harassment, where there's still a great deal of recruitment abuse that leads to debt bondage. And so that typical conventional corporate compliance based on codes and policy changes and trainings and things like that and conventional audits just isn't working. And so that's my fear, that a typical CSR program will just slot in there. And that's what we saw really with the UK Transparency Act, right? And the California Transparency Act, and the past couple of years with the Australian transparency regulations, where companies basically take what they've been doing for years and try to slot it into those requirements, but aren't really transforming what they're doing until they get caught, right? Perhaps by Customs or Border Protection, where they're then forced to, in order to get a withhold release order removed, dig in and pay remedy to workers and that sort of thing. So my concern is that we really need to inject into these due diligence regulations in Europe, but then also make sure that as customs here in the United States and elsewhere, as import bans proliferate, that the standards are based on proof, verifiable proof that workers' conditions have improved, or very specific business-oriented processes that have changed, right? Because now a lot of companies are still looking at, do we have a risk or do we not? And yet, generally, there's already a lot of information about which sectors and which countries are risky. They should just be assuming that their suppliers have risk rather than trying to parse out maybe that they have the unicorn supplier that somehow magically is immune to all the forces in that sector and country. And so I feel like when I talk about real metrics about improved circumstances for workers, I'm talking about things like showing what your data is on your wages now, and then sharing with the German regulators, for example, how those improve over a span of 1, 2, 3, 5 years, right? That's a real change. It doesn't matter how you do it. It doesn't matter what form of due diligence, whether you use this worker voice app or this grievance mechanism or this auditor or that auditor. We need to move away from the how and get to a point where we're saying, what are the impacts? Let's look at what's happening in the environmental sector. People don't expect companies, won't allow companies to get away with just saying, we're looking to see if we have a risk of connection to climate change. No, they're being asked to show exactly how they're changing their processes to reduce energy use, how they're changing chemicals to have a less harmful effect on the environment. So we need to move the labor space to that similar area where we're able to say, look, I don't care how you do this. If you substitute out, gas for oil or this or that, you're getting lower emissions or better environmental impact. We need to do that in labor, where we say, I don't care how you do it, but are the wages improving? Do you have less bondage? Do you have less sexual harassment? Do you have less discrimination against various vulnerable groups? And so I'm really hoping that those who are empowered to implement these due diligence and enforce them will reward the companies that have those real impacts and are public about how they do them and report them out in verifiable, credible ways, and not just kind of play around with, well, who has a better grievance system than somebody else? And so that's the paradigm shift that we need to metrics and impacts and information that proves that the company has done that. So just as an example, with Cumulus forced labor screen that we have at Verite, which is a platform by which companies can screen their suppliers, or investors can screen the companies that they invest in. And it asks for all sorts of information about really what happens in the recruitment of workers. It's a very intense paperwork heavy process to recruit workers. And so there are all sorts of contracts and powers of attorney, and really crucially, proof of payment about who's really paying for that migration. Now, we should, all of us in this realm, and certainly those who, whether they're at Customs and Border Protection enforcing an import ban, or as people in the EU doing so-called due diligence regulations, should be asking for proof of payment. Who's paying for the worker's journey? Don't tell me whether you have a policy against workers paying fee. Don't tell me you have a code of conduct that says forced labor is bad. Everybody has those. That's easy. Instead, show me who's paying for that worker's journey. And that will tell you if you have a company that's really doing proper due diligence, because if they're doing proper due diligence, they're going to be looking at all those details of how a worker goes from, say, India to Malaysia, or how a worker goes from Nepal to Saudi Arabia, or Mexico, or to the US, or what have you. And instead of just enabling companies to stay at this rhetorical level of saying we have a policy and we think it's forced labor is terrible and so on, you really expect them to show paperwork, show bank statements, show SWIFT codes, show other information that's at the heart of these business transactions. And that's where, companies, this is new for many companies to do so-called due diligence around labor issues, but companies do due diligence all the time on their suppliers about the quality of the product that they're creating for them, or about the materials they use, or due diligence on corruption. 40, 50, 60 years ago, when the US and other countries in the West began to crack down on corruption, people said it'll be impossible, right? There's no way we can root out corruption in international business. And yet, in many ways, it's been done. We have a very rigorous enforcement of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act here in the United States. And it's all based on companies finally figuring out how to do due diligence around that, solving a complex problem. So it can be done, but it's really incumbent on those with power. Now that power is with these regulators. Before, the power, say 20 years ago, the power was just how many activists could scream loud enough outside a Nike store or protest Walmart enough to try to get some change from a big company like that. And the vast majority of other companies, nobody was paying attention to. Now we have this opportunity for a German due diligence regulator, or a Canadian customs official, or a Japanese official, as they implement some of these things, to look at this and say, this so-called due diligence is a load of crap, right? I want to see some proof of higher wages, or some proof of who paid for the workers to get there. And so I'm really hoping we can move to that space. Like, let's forget about the statements. Let's forget about the rhetoric. Let's forget about the policies. Let's find some metrics that they can report against. And by the way, that'll be really important, because these laws, if we think about how things are in labor, we're in a way kind of following a couple of steps behind the environmental movement. Now investors and Securities and Exchange Commission here in the States, and I'm sure in Europe too, are beginning to look at the so-called ESG data and have more stringent requirements about what companies are reporting on. And I think it's only a matter of time before companies will have to report with very strong legal consequences if they report the wrong information, report on labor issues and human rights issues, not just on environmental issues. And those people at these exchange commissions, they're going to want data. They're going to want quantitative data. They're not going to want to judge whether you've trained your suppliers well on the code. They're going to want to know, whether you can demonstrate some quantitative improvement for workers.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more about your original point about the CSR kind of framework and your fear that the current legislation will accept that as due diligence. But with one caveat, and again, sorry, Shawn, that's not to detract from the fact that I'm 150% behind you when it comes to hoping that there's a movement of human beings and organizations, moving together now, wanting to focus due diligence on material improvements in workers' lives and on proven material improvements in workers' lives. But I think, there, if we look carefully at this legislation and, at older tools we've had in our toolbox, like the UNGPs, like OECD, that has always said, risk assessment alone and doing, having codes of conduct and loosely understanding through your various tools, what's going wrong, isn't enough. That you have to then address and track and prove and communicate. You have to then prove that you're doing something about it, prove that what you're doing is having a material impact and making the situation better, and then doing all the above in a format that you can then communicate, not just to your C-level, not just to your suppliers, but indeed back to those workers who we should be accountable to, in addition to the legislators. Be ready. And your points earlier about the fact that we used to due diligence. We've done it financially for decades. We now good at producing kind of hard data, or better at least. Not flawless. There've been some scandals there, but getting better at producing data on the environmental side. And we need to ensure that we up our game on the social and human rights side. I feel like brands and investors and enforcement agencies alike still look at the human rights side of supply chains and think it's all too soft and contingent, and that we getting hard metrics and getting reliable data is somehow, rather difficult and complex, and that hasn't been our experience, with the thing we do.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, NYDER has been successful in gathering a lot of data, right? And the issue, I think, is what will companies be expected by these regulators to report on? And again, that's where I feel like it's up to us who have a lot of knowledge of how supply chains operate to make suggestions to these regulators to say, ask companies for this rather than that, or don't be taken in to think that this is enough, or challenge them when they say it's complex in this way. Of course it's complex, but part of that is also then saying what is acceptable level of change over time, right? I think that's the other problem or challenge that we have in this arena, is that there's a bit of a fear that people have of saying this will take time to improve, right? Especially when you're talking about severe labor abuse. It's companies would rather, I think, just hope that the spotlight won't focus on them, and they won't have to essentially admit that they have this amount of, say, forced labor in their supply chain, and that they expect over 5 years to get it down to about this, but that there still may be some, right? Because it's such an egregious practice that they're afraid of saying, we're going to have less slavery. They'd rather just hope that nobody asks them whether they have slavery and whether they can go like this and remove it, right? But this is the kind of conversation that I think everybody needs to have, the advocacy groups, the companies, as well as the governments, to say, what does aggressive, robust, real, genuine change look like? But how long will that take to happen? And also begin to segment out by different sectors and perhaps different countries what that might look like. And then also rethink some assumptions. So what should a company do in a country like China is very different from what they're going to do in a country like India or Mexico or France, for that matter, right? The ability to change things differs. We also have to think, what are some of the sacred cows out there in the compliance world about when is it okay to leave a supplier because they're not likely to change? For a long time, that was called cut and run. It was seen as, oh, a company is going to avoid its responsibility. But I think we need to rethink, what are the criteria for when it's when it's okay for a company to leave after trying and putting a lot of resources into something, or what is the expectation for leaving China now? Essentially, because of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act here in the United States, as you know, anything connected to Xinjiang in China is banned from the U.S. market, and so that's causing a lot of consternation about what does that really mean in terms of how soon must a company exit China, exit, or at least exit the Xinjiang part of China, right? And now I think companies are just hoping they're not going to get caught, but there also isn't a sense of what is realistic for them to leave there. And that's just one case, right? What about Myanmar? Should companies be operating there or not? And if they decide they cannot continue to operate there because there's no sense that there'll be real change there, then how long should they have to exit, and how should they exit responsibly? So I think we have to rethink what that looks like everywhere, because we need to give a path to the companies, but also to the regulators to say, this is what reasonable looks like, but not so reasonable that it's an open situation where the companies themselves determine what the timeline is. But that's going to require more communication between civil society, unions, governments, and companies to say what's realistic. And I think that's something that people haven't been good at doing, right? Because in a way, it's almost easier to not talk about specific goals and specific activities and specific timelines, because it's easier to just talk from the different vantage points that we all have and not get down to specifics. But I'm hoping particularly in Europe, there's an opportunity for those of us with this kind of experience and expertise to push them toward more concrete expectations, more metrics, more verifiable metrics, and some sense of timeline about how they expect companies to advance over the years.
That's a beautiful closing, Shawn. An invitation to listen to some experts in the sector, and to look quite specifically, the legislators first, but also the brands but legislators first on concrete expectations, robust metrics, and the timeline for improvement. There's so much more to be said on where that leads us when it comes to parts of supply chains that are more or less visible, and the whole concept of continuous improvement and the extent to which it can be helpful versus an excuse. There's
Right.
all sorts of, there's so much more to be discussed.
You
Also,
mentioned the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and I really want to stress this issue of remedy. I should have mentioned it before, but the concept of due diligence isn't just what companies should be doing, but this greater attention on remedy for workers. And I feel like that's another trend where people are finally coming around to recognizing that it's not just about the behavior of companies, but how people who have been affected by these deserve remedy and deserve justice, right? It's not just returning money that was stolen from them, but additional forms of compensation and justice. And so I feel like there's a real opportunity in this concept of due diligence, or in the way that an import ban is implemented, as we've seen here in the U.S. with the insistence on repaying workers before a withhold release order is revoked, that this key issue of worker input, worker voice, workers saying what happened to them, workers defining what compensation and remedy looks like, will be a foundational pillar to how due diligence is implemented, right? Because there's always the concern that due diligence is about this process of determining what suppliers you have or what have you or whatever, but not following through to actual remedy. And so there's been more attention on the remedy side of the UNGPs. And I think with the right of action under the mandatory human rights due diligence, where workers and other rights holders may be able to sue directly, I think we're going to be seeing more around remedy. And it's incumbent on all of us to add momentum to that, because it's cynically, it's the remedy, it's the requirement to pay remedy that gets the attention of the C-suite to then change behavior, right? That's definitely what we're seeing with the withhold release orders with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So I think it's important to note that too. There are two sides to that. The remedy requires companies to put up some money, and that gets the attention and hopefully will lead to change. But it also is the right thing for rights holders who for too long have been ignored in these discussions.
And when you consider the definition of remedy, it's not just addressing individual cases. It's addressing the risk of this practice being pervasive. It's about addressing the kind of very infrastructure and dynamics of power that led us to this particular case in the first place. So
right.
I think again, it would be such a service for companies and supply chains, but most importantly for workers, to undertake a very thorough exercise of trying to specify what constitutes the kind of practice of providing remedy. And I think there, as you put it, Shawn, the interesting part is in particular cases, what constitutes as appropriate remedy is decided behind office doors. But the odd part is that, and wider kind of, this is our daily work, is we engage with workers, we engage with stakeholders, and there are scalable ways of doing that very effectively. And it would be so easy to take a series of remediation options when there's been a particular violation, and to feed that back to the workforces affected and get those workforces to signal which remediation would be most appropriate, because they're living the reality.
Yeah.
So I think when you hear the term stakeholder engagement bandied about in these in the context of kind of literacy and training around human rights due diligence, we have to take that feedback loop seriously, because it'll help the companies involved with providing remediation which they're needing to invest in, that's actually effective, because it factors in the workers' kind of preferences, but it also means that it'll save them potentially from having to kind of undo and redo remediation for the years to come, when they have actioned a solution that works in Washington but not in Burma.
Right. Yeah.
Or Myanmar.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more but I think that's where those who are defining what due diligence looks like and are evaluating due diligence plans and so on need to ask those kind of questions. So tell me, what have you done? What approach have you used? What mechanism have you used to engage with workers or other rights holders about their notion of remedy, right? So it's not just have you paid remedy, it's what was your mechanism that you use to ensure that that remedy was what the workers wanted, right? It's just one or two questions that's fleshing out this notion of due diligence in a more specific way. Like I was saying before with ethical recruitment, it's not just are you against workers paying fees? It's asking several key questions that get to the heart of whether something is being done properly and whether they really have proof of change. So around remedy, that's a great suggestion. Like what due diligence processes, ongoing circular due diligence processes do you have, like an and wider, that are guaranteeing that this remedy, first of all, reaches the person that's supposed to get to? Have you verified that they actually got their money back, or have you verified that the apology happened, or whatever, the land was returned to them? But then also, what is your proof that that is acceptable to that community? That's what they need. So it's just adding those additional questions that can really pierce through to whether what the company says it's doing is a process that's genuine and that's having impact. And because of technology, we're now able to reach out to rights holders and ask them.
Sneaking in one more topic, Shawn. We've spoken a lot about the due diligence legislation and the import ban, and the interesting kind of risks associated with all the above. The fact that it's individuated, per brand, and the fact that it could be a tick box exercise, and the fact that brands could kind of inappropriately focus on the front end of the process and not the back end, kind of tracking, not focused on real material kind of evidence of improvement. But there's one more that's very important, and that is, a lot of the human rights risks and challenges in global supply chains are not business specific. They are not local problems that are a byproduct of the choices and practices on that work floor or on that plantation. They're a byproduct sometimes of structural problems and practices that go way beyond the parameters of that business, and therefore affect other supply chains, other brands, other suppliers in that same setting. And therefore, human rights due diligence will never, be rigorous and effective without collaboration. And kind of, human rights due diligence, should be, your point, focused on material improvement. That material improvement, especially with these more structural issues, cannot happen without quite a deep material and practical collaboration between brands. So I think, it would be great if, legislators and the enforcement officers, as well as the brands, kind of looking at these new laws and thinking what's needed, that we all keep collaboration, in front of mind. We all remind ourselves that some of these issues are old and run deep, not irreparable. Nothing is ever beyond the scope of change, but that sometimes brands need to drop the kind of competitive issues they have with collaborating with certain other brands also sourcing along the same supply chains from the same geography, and recognize that the best chance of actually addressing and generating this material improvement will be if they share that responsibility and share the costs of doing so, and perhaps share some of the interventions that they offer to suppliers in that setting to support them.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the concept of due diligence includes questions and actual metrics related to impact from brand collaboration, from industry association work, but also with what companies are doing either individually or as part of groups with governments, right? So I think there's been a lot of advance and understanding, particularly around things like responsible recruitment, that when companies start delving into this issue, they realize they need to get the government to be enforcing their own laws or managing guest worker systems differently, right? It gets back to one of my initial comments, where before, national governments aren't enforcing their own laws. So when companies are put under the gun to do it, then they suddenly realize, yeah, these governments should be doing this. But that's part of due diligence too. What are you doing beyond just complaining that the local government isn't doing is corrupt or isn't enforcing its own laws or is letting these labor recruitment agencies operate in a particular way? Show us what you're doing to try to impact what those governments are doing. Tell us specifically how the collaboration you have with your peer companies or within your industry group or something, what specifically are you pushing for and how effective was it? Because again, a lot of companies can say, oh, we're part of joint efforts. That's not what we need. We need evidence of impact for how you're engaging with government. What exactly are you asking them? And so I think that's part of a comprehensive, well-rounded notion of due diligence, not just how you're engaging with rights holders and other stakeholders, but how are you very specifically with what particular impact metrics are you engaging with other businesses and with governments? And the expectations would be different, right? If you're a company that has minuscule leverage because you're trying to focus on impacting a situation with a commodity 7 layers down the supply chain, yes, that's true. Their leverage is different, and so your expectations for their due diligence and their engagement efforts will change, whether it's a first tier or 7th tier, right? Or whether it's a problem that's specific in a workplace, like around fire safety or something, where it really is more between the buyer and supplier what's changing, or a problem like child labor or some of these other issues that are deeply embedded in the community and deeply connected to the ways governments operate or don't operate. And so it's not just kind of giving up and saying, oh, that's so hard, it's so complex, it's so far down my supply chain. It's rather saying, what does due diligence, what does proper engagement, what does real change, again, like I say, robust but realistic change over time with continuous improvement, look like in those different scenarios? So I think that's part of fleshing out this notion of due diligence, is how it will need to be different under different circumstances.
Completely. Oh, Shawn, thank you for all this time and for the detail and for the kind of what always comes out of you kind of spontaneously, this thought leadership. I hope we can continue to focus on, material improvement, to continue to kind of find the practical ways of doing so in different contexts in a pragmatic manner, and how how membership organizations and all of us can continually kind of chase collaborations that are impactful.
Right.
So on that note, thank you, Shawn, for this excellent input, as always, really specific and wise. And I hope all our listeners to this podcast got something out of it. And please get in touch if you want to learn more, either from Verite or from MacDonald. And look forward to producing some more podcast content soon. Thank you.
That's it from us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn to keep up to date with all things MacDonald, and look out for our next installment. Goodbye.